Snitches don't get stitches. Snitches get erased from the map. Socially, mentally, and if they're unlucky, physically. Welcome to ADX Florence, the place built for the people the system refuses to gamble on. Here, silence isn't just a rule, it's architecture, it's policy, it's the air moving through the vents. If control had a blueprint, this is the final draft. So how did a prison like this even become real? Rewind to the early 1990s. Federal prisons weren't just crowded, they were volatile. High-ranking gang leaders ran playbooks from the inside. Terror cells recruited through the bars. Violence against staff spiked, and wardens knew a basic truth. You can't stop a chess master if he still has a board. The Bureau of Prisons decided the only way to prevent chaos everywhere else was to concentrate it in one place and then pin it to the ground. That solution opened in 1995 on a stretch of high desert in Colorado. Administrative Maximum, or ADX. It wasn't pitched as a hospital for change. It was engineered as a dead end for influence. The idea was brutally simple. If you can't stop certain inmates from manipulating, recruiting, or ordering hits, you remove the possibility. Separate them from staff. Separate them from each other. Separate them from anyone they might persuade, threaten, or charm. You don't bargain with the storm, you build thicker walls, and ADX from the outside looks like nothing special. Low, squared-off buildings, tan concrete, sky that goes on forever. But step past the secure doors and you feel the philosophy in your bone. Corridors curve so you can't see too far ahead. Doors don't swing open with jangling keys, they click because someone, somewhere decides they should. Movement isn't a commute, it's choreography. You don't arrive at ADX so much as you get subtracted. Name, status, noise gone. What remains is measured in inches and minutes. A cell roughly the size of a parking space becomes your entire map. Concrete bed. Concrete desk. Polished steel instead of glass. Fixtures shaped so you can't use them as weapons against others or yourself. The only window is a sliver angled to let in light but not views. Outside is technically right there, but psychologically it might as well be the moon. The schedule is a loop. You eat alone. You read alone. You shower alone. Rec happens inside a concrete pen with a grate overhead, a rectangle of sky you can look at but never walk into. If you toe every line, you may earn a small TV. A closed system of programming vetted for calm structure and compliance. A book becomes a prize, a blanket becomes a privilege, and the biggest currency of all is minutes out of that cell. Everything is a trade obedience for oxygen. But the real pressure here isn't the concrete, it's the quiet. The kind of quiet that gets inside your head and starts rearranging furniture. People think isolation is peace. In doses, maybe. In months and years, it becomes a second warden. Sleep gets choppy. Time gets slippery. Your thoughts echo so loud they start arguing with themselves. That's why the survivors build little routines like lifeboats. Stretch, breathe, read, write. Because patterns are the only anchors when days stop having edges. From the outside it sounds like a clean solution. Concentrate danger in one box so the rest of the system can breathe. And to be fair, the roster at ADX reads like a who's who of modern menace. The Boston Marathon bomber? Locked down. A cartel boss who slipped out of other prisons? Locked down. The message is as blunt as a steel door. Nobody escapes this place. Not physically and not strategically. If you're here, your radius of influence is a circle the size of your cell. And yet, there's a darker question humming underneath the fluorescent lights. If you neutralize a person by compressing them into near total silence, what exactly are you shaping in the process? Are you building safety or building something else entirely? Because inside ADX, the line between secure housing and sensory deprivation isn't a line at all. It's a gradient, and depending on where you stand, that gradient looks like either smart containment or slow motion damage. The truth is, ADX wasn't born from boredom or cruelty. It was born from fear of guards being ambushed, of gangs issuing orders across state lines, of spectacular violence planned from inside ordinary cell blocks. The designers answered those fears with control at every scale, camera angles, door timings, even the geometry of the hallways. The place is a machine, with one job: sever every wire that connects a high-risk inmate to the outside world and keep it severed. And by that metric, it worked. The headlines stop, the phone calls stop, the plots stop. But the machine didn't freeze in 1995. It learned from its own worst day. One afternoon in the mid-2000s, the idea of carefully supervised group recreation met reality, and the cost was blood. After that, the rules tightened in a way everyone could feel, even the ones who'd never thrown a punch. If the promise of the Supermax was order, the price was going to be paid in human contact. That's the world we're stepping into next. The day the yard went silent, and why one killing reshaped life for hundreds of men who had nothing to do with it. Because at ADX, when something breaks, the fix always lands on the body, your routine, your mind. It happened fast, too fast for cameras and protocols to calm the storm. A carefully screened yard session, a handful of men in a debt that didn't vanish just because the walls were taller. One inmate didn't walk back. Word traveled the way it always does in closed systems. Whispers, steel, and the sudden disappearance of privileges no one realized were fragile. Overnight, the experiment of controlled group recreation became a memory. The yard went quiet. The doors stayed shut, and a single act stamped a new rule across the entire facility. Human contact is a risk. The system won't take twice. From then on, the choreography tightened. Movement became math. One man, one corridor, one door at a time, no exceptions unless the exception enhanced control. Even sound got regulated. Conversations that once crackled through vents or door slots were smothered by distance, by timing, by architecture that bent sight lines and swallowed echoes. If you wanted proof that ADX was designed to erase leverage, this was it. The removal of even supervised contact in the place built to supervise everything. Inside the cells, a different contest started. The body can adapt to a lot, but the mind hates empty space. Without people to bounce off, thoughts run laps. Time turns elastic. A day can feel like a minute or like a winter. That's why survival here isn't about winning fights. It's about not fighting yourself. The guys who last build routines like scaffolding, wake at the same hour, push-ups until your chest burns, breathing drills to keep panic from blooming, pages read like rations, pages written like proof that you still exist. It's not motivational poster stuff, it's triage. Items most of us ignore become currency. A pencil is a spine. A paperback is a window. A thin blanket becomes a promise that night won't be endless. Earned TV time doesn't just pass minutes, it dulls the edges of the silence. Even then, every reward arrives with a string. Behavior, follow the rules, and your world grows by inches. Slip and it shrinks right back. But control isn't neutral, it leaves fingerprints. Sleep fractures into shards. The brain starts inventing company in the hum of the vents. Some men pace lines so deep into the concrete they could pass for seams. Others retreat inward and don't come back unchanged. That's the paradox. The cleaner the prison's command of the environment, the messier the inner weather can get. And while policy says isolation is a tool, on your worst nights it feels like a solvent. When conflict does flare, the response is swift and theatrical. Restraint chairs, extraction teams in layered gear, chemicals that sting first and make you cough after. Reports get filed under neat phrases like use of force, but the experience isn't neat. It's loud, blinding, choking. Whether you started it or just moved wrong at the wrong time hardly matters in the moment. The lesson lands the same way every time. Push and you'll meet the machine. Even hunger becomes a lover. Refuse meals long enough and the institution answers with tubes and tape and a kind of clinical persistence that feels nothing like care. It's not about hunger or health, not really. It's about refusing the body the right to opt out. The message is steady. The system will not allow you to control the one thing you still have, your own decline. So men adjust. Not all, and not always, but enough to prove that habits can be armor. The good days are tiny. A full night's sleep, a book that makes an hour vanish, snow drifting past that narrow window like a screensaver from another life. The bad days are jagged. A scream bleeding down the hall, the thud of boots, the sudden cold of a privilege pulled without warning. You learn to ride both without letting either define you. You learn to keep your head down, not because you're broken, but because the cost of lifting it is measured in pain. That cost isn't just paid inside, it shows up later when some men finally step past the gate and discover the world is too loud, too bright, too alive. Your nervous system, trained to respect silence as safety, treats a crowded street like a trap. A stranger's laugh can sound like an alarm. A bus braking feels like a raid. That's the debt isolation collects. Even when the door opens, it doesn't open all the way. Still, the institution insists it can manage the fallout, programs, evaluations, step-down paths that promise more time out, more chances to speak, more glimpses of normal. The philosophy is simple: behave and you'll get inches of your life back. But inches are small, and by the time you earn them, you may not remember how to use them. That's the quiet tragedy you can't see on a blueprint, the way control, once it lives in your bones, keeps collecting rent long after you leave the property. And yet, for the people the public fears most, ADX offers something no other place does: the certainty that nothing will spill. No phone order violence, no cross-prison empire, no headline that begins with "from behind bars." That certainty has a cost. The question is whether we're comfortable paying it with years of silence and minds that don't come out the way they went in. For years, the Bureau of Prisons insisted that ADX wasn't cruel. It was necessary. Official statements framed it as the only way to neutralize the most dangerous men in America. But cracks started to show, not in the concrete walls, but in the stories trickling out through letters, lawyers, and the few rare interviews with men who had walked back into daylight. Those cracks widened into one of the most important legal battles ever waged against a U.S. prison. The case was called Cunningham v. Sy, Federal Bureau of Prisons. Filed in 2012, it wasn't just one man's complaint. It was a chorus of voices from inside, led by 11 inmates who claimed that ADX was more than a prison. It was a psychological pressure cooker where treatment for mental illness barely existed, if at all. They argued that the system was ignoring, and in some cases worsening, serious psychiatric conditions. Depression, paranoia, violent self-harm, symptoms that didn't begin at ADX but thrived there. The timing of the lawsuit forced uncomfortable questions into daylight. While European countries were limiting solitary confinement to 15 days to avoid permanent damage, the US was locking people down for decades. Attorneys for the inmates didn't just argue abstract rights. They told stories that sounded less like discipline and more like slow-motion collapse. Men biting off their own fingers, others smearing walls with blood or worse, screams echoing down corridors long after the lights dimmed. To the Bureau of Prisons, these were outliers. To the plaintiffs, they were proof that the system wasn't just confining, it was dismantling human beings. What made the suit explosive was the gap between official testimony and lived reality. In a 2012 Senate hearing on solitary confinement, the BOP's own director, Charles Samuels, told lawmakers that no seriously mentally ill inmates were housed at ADX. But the paper trail didn't match the claim. Internal records and eyewitness accounts showed men with diagnosed schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and borderline personality disorder locked in those cells. And their condition wasn't stabilizing, it was deteriorating. One inmate, Harold Cunningham, described being stripped of his clothes for weeks at a time, shackled to his bed with only a blanket, denied showers, and served food so stale and rotten it barely counted as nutrition. He wrote of being beaten while handcuffed, his body becoming the canvas for a punishment that had no official name. Another, Jesse Wilson, wrote that he hadn't slept in weeks because of the constant pounding of his non-existent, mentally ill neighbors who kept him awake with screams, banging, and the foul stench of filth smeared across cell doors. His words dripped with sarcasm. This is what should be thought of as a lie. The pressure worked. In 2016, the Bureau of Prisons agreed to a settlement. Over 100 prisoners with diagnosed mental illness were transferred out of ADX to facilities better equipped for treatment. Licensed professionals were tasked with performing screenings, and new guidelines were written to prevent the worst cases of neglect. On paper, it looked like a step toward accountability. In practice, it was more complicated. For the men who remained, the settlement didn't open doors or shorten sentences. It simply promised that officials would check their minds along with their meals. And yet even that limited change signaled something bigger. The American public was starting to ask whether control could cross the line into cruelty. The lawsuit peeled back the myth of the flawless machine and showed that behind every steel door was a nervous system ticking like a time bomb. The Bureau had spent 2 decades selling ADX as the fortress no one could escape. But the truth was, men were escaping all the time, slipping into madness, carving up their own bodies, or stepping back into society so warped by silence that they couldn't function. The walls kept them, the system couldn't keep them whole. That realization pushed reforms beyond the lawsuit. Officials rolled out something new, a program designed not just to contain, but to treat. They called it Stages, a carefully structured path meant to teach coping skills and emotional regulation for inmates with borderline personality disorder. It stood for Steps Toward Awareness, Growth, and Emotional Strength. A neat acronym, but also a promise that maybe, just maybe, the system could do more than press pause on human life. Combined with a step-down program that rewarded compliance with gradual increases in freedom, ADX started presenting itself not as an endless tomb, but as a tunnel with a very faint light at the end. But here's the catch. That light depends entirely on behavior. For every inch of progress, one misstep can erase months. Miss a rule, lose your privileges. Push back, and you're back in the cell where you started, staring at a slit of sky and wondering if progress was ever real at all. Rehabilitation, in this context, isn't about growth. It's about obedience. And the question that lingers is whether obedience born from fear of punishment is anything like recovery. The Bureau now claims that no one should spend more than 3 years in the deepest level of solitary at ADX. In theory, after 12 months, compliant inmates begin to earn more time outside their cells, more chances to interact, and eventually transfer to less restrictive prisons. But theory and practice aren't always twins, and for the men counting days by scratches on the wall, 3 years can feel like 30. Paper reform doesn't always reach through concrete. So is ADX still the fortress of silence it was in the 1990s, or has it become something softer, more modern, more humane? That depends on who you ask. Ask a warden, and you'll hear about structure and order. Ask a lawyer, and you'll hear about rights and violations. Ask a man who's lived there, and you might hear about the snow outside a window, his only proof the world hadn't stopped moving. Picture it. 11 years in near total silence. Then one morning, the door opens, and you're not just free of the cell, you're free of ADX itself. The Colorado desert is behind you, but the machine never really let go. For many men, release from ADX isn't liberation, it's collision. Crowds feel like ambushes. A passing car horn feels like an alarm. A stranger's glance sparks the same reflex as a guard's command. After years of routine so strict you could set a watch by it, the chaos of ordinary life is paralyzing. One former inmate described stepping out into Times Square after his sentence ended. The neon, the roar of traffic, the press of bodies, it wasn't excitement. It was terror. His nervous system had been rewired to see noise as danger and silence as safety. Society was suddenly the threat. Some men relapse immediately, not out of malice, but because they no longer know how to exist outside of the box. Jabbar Currents was one of them. After serving more than a decade at ADX, he walked out with nothing but a paper bag of belongings and a fragile grip on reality. 3 days later, he was arrested again for an assault in a public park. His story isn't unique. It's a brutal reminder that you can leave ADX physically, but mentally, you might still be pacing that 7x12 cell. Others avoid reoffending, but the damage shows up in quieter ways. Sleepless nights. Panic in grocery store aisles, eyes darting every time a door clicks shut. Conversations that collapse because silence feels safer than words. Even the smallest social exchanges, ordering food, shaking a hand, can feel like breaking a rule you don't remember. These men don't come home healed. They come home broken in ways that don't always leave visible scars. That's the paradox society has to wrestle with. ADX was built to contain the uncontainable, and by that metric, it works. No one has ever escaped. El Chapo, the Unabomber, the Boston Marathon bomber, names that once defined terror now vanish into concrete and silence. For the public, that's reassurance. But safety outside comes at the cost of human collapse inside. The question is whether we can live with that bargain. The US insists ADX is humane because it has step-down programs, screenings, and mental health treatment on the books. But the reality is harsher. A third of the population has documented mental illness. Lawsuits have forced reforms, but reform doesn't erase decades of silence already baked into bones. Compared to European standards, where anything past 15 days of solitary is considered a human rights violation, America is still running its own experiment, one that treats isolation not as emergency medicine, but as a way of life. And here's the unsettling part. ADX doesn't just remove people from society. It removes society from people. The longer you're inside, the harder it is to bring you back. Rehabilitation, the word most prisons are supposed to aim for, slips away. What's left is management, containment, and a steady drip of silence until the clock runs out. So what does that mean for us? On one side, there's the argument that ADX keeps the most dangerous criminals neutralized, unable to direct chaos from the inside. On the other, there's the uncomfortable truth that we're not just locking away crimes, we're locking away minds, sometimes until there's nothing left to recover. ADX Florence proves one thing beyond doubt. Control works. It silences voices, it stops plots, and it guarantees no dramatic prison breaks splashed across the news. But it also proves something darker. When you erase every connection a person has, you don't just stop the bad, you erase the human. And when that process is complete, what returns to the world, if anything returns at all, may not be a person capable of living in it. At ADX, survival isn't about other inmates, it's about yourself. And that's why this place, tucked away in the Colorado desert, remains one of the most chilling symbols of American justice, a machine that doesn't just cage bodies, but bends minds. The real question is whether we want safety at any cost, or whether some costs leave wounds no society should accept. Because in the end, ADX doesn't just lock away criminals. It locks away the part of us that believes people can change.